Fantastic. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Barry Colfer, and a very, very warm welcome here to those joining us in person in full Technicolor at the Institute of International European Affairs in Dublin, and indeed a great welcome to those joining online. Our discussion today is on the future of transport powering Ireland's mobility transition, and we have a great panel, but my only duty today is to say thanks for coming and also to thank our moderator, Lisa Ryan, Professor in Energy Economics at UCD. Thanks for taking the time to moderate. And I'm going to hand over to you to introduce our excellent panel, and just thanks to our panelists for being here as well. Lisa.
Okay, I'll stay here if that's all right.
Please.
Okay, welcome everybody and good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here for the Rethink Energy, the latest in the series, and actually the last of 2025. And this is, I'm sure as many of you know, this is the lecture series that is hosted by IIEA and run with ESB. That's been running for a few years now, I believe. This lecture series deals with the energy transition, brings together stakeholders from industry, academia, policymakers, and today it's all dealing with the energy transition. And today we are moving on to transport, which of course is one of the great opportunities, but seems to be mostly challenges in many ways, if we're looking at clean energy transition. So we have an excellent panel, Professor Brian Caulfield, who is Professor of Transportation in Trinity College Dublin. We have Aoife O'Grady, who leads ZEVI, which is the Zero Energy Vehicle, I always forget what the I stands for. Ireland, thank you, in the Office of the Department of Transport, which funds EV infrastructure and charging infrastructure and supports the uptake of vehicles. And finally, we have Dr. Euan McTurk, who is giving the keynote address on all things electric vehicles and basically the transition to decarbonised transport. So the way this will work, before I hand over to Dr. McTurk, is we're going to have a keynote address by Dr. McTurk, then we're going to have a panel discussion, and then we'll open it up to a Q&A, both with people in the room and also our online participants. So I think that's all the housekeeping, is it, Barry? Thank you. Yes. So I'm going to introduce then Dr. McTurk. So Dr. McTurk is a consultant battery electrochemist who has been working on and driving electric vehicles since 2009. He's been carrying out research into next generation cell chemistries at the University of Oxford, pushing commercial lithium-ion cells to their limits at WMG at the University of Warwick, and building a state-of-the-art battery test facility in Edinburgh. So he is also very present in social media. He has a YouTube channel, which is the EV myth-busting channel Plug Life Television. And he is now a consultant which provides technical, strategic and public outreach expertise to governments, to academia, to lots of us. So I will invite you now to give your talk, and I will try to keep you on time if I need to, but we're looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Cheers. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. So yeah, today we're going to be looking at the barriers and how to overcome them when it comes to moving towards transport decarbonisation in Ireland. And what better way to show the progress that's been made in Ireland than showing you a charging hub from Dundee in Scotland, which is only a few years old, but is already arguably obsolete, and we should be aiming to do something far better than this, as you will see in later slides. So Lisa, you did a fantastic job of introducing me, so I can skip straight past this first introductory slide. So we've got 4 segments today. We're looking at balancing the grid, we're looking at balancing raw materials, balancing social equality, and balancing the government's books as well to make sure that this is going to be economically as well as environmentally sustainable. So let's start with the grid and the old question of what happens if we were to all plug in at the same time? So according to the reliable source of information that is the internet, Ireland has just shy of 2.5 million cars in it today, the average annual mileage of which is just over 16,000 kilometres. And if they were all electric, then you'd be looking at, oh goodness me, imperial to sensible metric figures on the fly here. I think it's about 5.5 kilometres per kilowatt hour that you'd be able to do. And that would mean that you'd be looking at a daily electricity consumption per vehicle of 8 kilowatt hours. Bearing in mind that the average home charge point is about 7 kilowatts, then you're looking at roughly an hour to charge them every night, if you were to plug in every night. So if everyone was to come back home at the exact same time and plug in at the exact same time, what would it do to the grid? So first of all, if we have a look at the average Irish electricity demand, circa 4 gigawatts, if we have a look at the peak demand, about 5.5-ish gigawatts, we would actually need 17.29 gigawatts just to charge cars. So that's 4.5 times the average Irish electricity demand. Thankfully, that's never going to happen because, well, actually, before we get onto that, some people will say, oh, hydrogen's better at this point. But it's worth pointing out that if you're making hydrogen from renewables, you require between 2.5 and 3 times as much electricity to produce enough hydrogen to get vehicles to travel the same distance in the first place. So let's just pop that silly bubble there. So we can be smarter than that. Staggered charging, smart charging. If we say that you're typically driving home, plugging in at 6 p.m. and then unplugging at 8 a.m. to go to work again, you've got 14 hours where the car is sat still. So that means if we were to divide through that power demand by those 14 hours, you'd be looking at 1.25 gigawatts basically, which is about a third of the Irish electricity demand. It's still a considerable increase, but we can be more clever than this. So again, we don't need to worry. Grid demand fluctuates throughout the day. Now, there are summer and winter scenarios, but we've only got time to cover summer in what's going to be a very hectic half hour. So if we have a look, this is a sort of typical summer's day from earlier this year, looking at midday on the 31st of July to midday on the 1st of August. You can see that there were peaks in use when everyone was coming, their cars, putting on their dinner, etc. And then peaks when industry started to really sort of pick up again at 9 a.m. the next day. Overnight, there was a sort of trough in demand where obviously everyone was asleep. So that means that we can take advantage of the fact that the grid is able to supply that amount of power but doesn't have the demand to do so. We can fill that trough and we can get an extra 7.3 gigawatt hours out of the existing, not just grid capacity, but so, just looking at the kind of peak demand of the grid as what it was doing that day. So that means we only require an extra 890 megawatts, which is about 15% of the all-time peak grid demand, which is still, it's a reasonable number, but it's nowhere near as insurmountable as 17.29 gigawatts. But that said, Ireland has over 6 gigawatts of thermal power plants installed. So that's already more than enough to cover that extra demand. But that said, of course, we want to be going green. Ireland's also got more than 5 gigawatts of renewable capacity installed. And yeah, that's not all going to be going full pelt at the same time, but for all of the time that the wind is blowing and the sun is shining, you're reducing the amount of thermal power plant that's actually required. And it's, at the moment, we've still got those several gigawatts of thermal power plants, which means that they can be ramped up if required. And they will make far more efficient use of the fuels that power them and then go on to power EVs than it would to fill a petrol or diesel car with liquid fuel and then just burn it in an internal combustion engine. But there's also increasing competition for electricity from data centers. So I would say that we should be mandating that data centers be as self-sufficient as possible, bring their own battery energy storage, bring their own renewables, and equally for large charging hubs for EVs, we should be looking at building their own renewables and energy storage. And I'll show you an excellent example of that in just a minute. Also, we should be incentivizing home and workplace renewables alongside home and workplace charging infrastructure.
Quite informative. The only thing is especially about hydrogen, the whole thing.
Solar PV or a typical home solar panel setup. That produces
about
kilowatt hours per annum, which is enough to cover the average Irish mileage for an EV. So how will we stagger charging? There's a couple of options for your home charge points. To be honest, I've used the MyEnergy Zappi as an example here, but there's so many other brands now of home smart charge point that do the exact same thing. So you're measuring the output of home renewables, for example, the 4 kilowatts peak from the solar panels there. You're measuring what the house is pulling, in this example, 1.5 kilowatts, and you pump the difference directly into the car without importing electricity from the grid. So that way, your house and your car effectively become self-sufficient on a sunny day. Obviously, if a cloud goes across and your solar power output dips, then the charge point is smart enough to dial back the amount of power going into the car and potentially pause the charging session until it brightens up again. And that way, you are maximizing the use of your home renewables, which means that you have even cheaper motoring and household bills as well. But looking at, on a bigger scale, Instavolt has shown us how it can be done. So their new Winchester Super Hub has 44 160 kilowatt fast chargers on what is actually a sub 1 megawatt grid supply. So that works out at about 23 kilowatts per charger if it was all to be completely fed from the grid. But there is a large on-site solar farm and battery energy storage system which provides the bulk of the power to this site. And that means that there's been a substantial reduction in the cost and size of the grid connection. It means it's been able to be deployed faster because they've not had to wait for a grid upgrade. Grid upgrades in the UK at the moment are horrifically expensive. So that's actually the savings they've done by doing this, by adding solar and batteries, which has worked out cheaper than that grid connection. They've passed on to the consumer. So the tariff that they have, if you charge at the Winchester Super Hub, is cheaper than the tariff if you go for their older 50 kilowatt, 100% grid powered sites. They're literally passing on massive savings to you, the consumer, and still making money off of you. So we have to motor on now, obviously, and have a look at other things that we need to balance. Raw materials, of course, is a prime example. So what actually is in a lithium-ion cell? Well, we'll run through these materials. There's copper, there's graphite, nothing too exciting about that. Lithium, obviously pretty contentious in some circles. Plasticky, polymery stuff as a separator. An electrolyte, which is just an organic liquid or gel with some salt in it. And then you'll have some aluminium and a lithium metal oxide. So that's generally something that contains cobalt, with the exception of the one at the bottom, lithium iron phosphate, LFP, which we'll go on to later on. So lithium and cobalt are the ones that make all the headlines. And let's look at those in more detail. There is the former Canadian town of Cobalt. No prizes for guessing what they used to mine there. But is cobalt recovered from batteries today? Yes, it is. In fact, it's the most valuable material in the lithium-ion cell, and it's the reason that lithium-ion cell recycling techniques started to be developed in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s. And I believe one of the first sites in Europe was in Golspie in the Highlands in 2004. EU battery regulation has recently been introduced that means that new batteries must contain at least 16% recycled cobalt content if they use cobalt from 2031 onwards. There are similar targets for other materials such as nickel and lithium. So there's basically a circular economy enshrined in EU regulation now, I should say. Are we going to run out? We're definitely not. If we have a look at some figures, admittedly from a few years ago, Democratic Republic of Congo is the biggest, sort of the lion's share of the provision of cobalt at the moment. But in 2021, there were almost 171,000 tons of cobalt that were extracted, which is enough for 38 million Tesla Model 3s, and that's just 1 year's output of a supply chain that is ramping up. Are we going to be priced out by increasing demand? No, we are not. So if cobalt was to quadruple in price overnight, that would mean that there would be an increase in the cost of a battery pack of at most 10%, and chances are that would not be passed on to the consumer. And if we have a look at the evolution of the phasing out of cobalt over the years, that first chemistry there, LCO, lithium cobalt oxide, that was the first commercially available lithium-ion chemistry. I think it was in a Sony video camera back in 1991, 1992, and it's still in a lot of smartphones today. 39% of that was cobalt. The BMW i3, when it launched in 2013, used NMC 111, nickel, manganese, cobalt 111. So that means 1 part nickel, 1 part manganese, 1 part cobalt. Instant 66% reduction versus LCO for your cobalt use. NMC 622 and NMC 811 are far more commonplace today. So again, you're looking at slashing the cobalt content by 90% versus original LCO. And that happened within the space of about a decade of the Nissan Leaf being launched. NCA is similar but different, and it's used in Teslas. But LFP, lithium iron phosphate, is basically made of rust and fertilizer. There's not much exciting in it. Ferric phosphate tablets are used for slug control. So that's the sort of cheap material that we're dealing with. And it's used extensively in buses as well as an increasing range of electric cars today. Ember's intercity bus services in Scotland run from Edinburgh to Aberdeen and back on a single charge using these super cheap, supposedly not as long range energy dense batteries, but it just shows you what's possible. So as I said, LCO is still used in smartphones, and it's 10 times more cobalt to make a smartphone battery in terms of absolute percentages compared to the latest long-range electric vehicles. But the popularity of LFP means that there's loads of EVs out there, including cars, vans, and buses, that have no cobalt in them whatsoever. And look just how little lithium there is in any lithium-ion cell. So if we have a look at what Tesla's chucking out of Shanghai at the moment, their gigafactory there, your standard range cells are LFP, so there's no cobalt. The long range ones are NMC 811, which is 4%. And if we have a look at what's happening over in the States, that should technically be a picture of a Tesla Roadster rather than a Model S, but it was 11 kilograms of cobalt per car. By 2020, they'd slashed that to 4.5 kilos, and they're continuing to decline. The latest NCA uses less cobalt than NMC 811. And if we have a look at some of the most recent research from Jeff Dan's research group. He's very closely affiliated with Tesla and their team. They've discovered that the cobalt that's in NCA was probably just in there for the ride. We don't actually need it the way we'd previously thought. So you could substitute it for a more abundant, more ethical metal. And in terms of the ethics, for any cobalt that is still used, the Fair Cobalt Alliance is all about actively working to eliminate child labour and to ensure that there's fair wages, to ensure there's safe working conditions. When we look at the artisanal mining that is a tiny percentage of the output of Democratic Republic of Congo, that is a whole story for another time that we don't have time to go into. But have a look at the companies. Admittedly, this is a bit of an old slide. There are a couple that are no longer with us, but you've got Freyr, you've got LG Energy Solution, you've got Tesla, big EV manufacturers and battery manufacturers, and Glencore, which is a major mining company, of course. Oil and gas companies are conspicuous in their absence, which is interesting because an inconvenient fact about cobalt for petrol heads is cobalt is used in the refining of petrol and diesel and is the highest tonnage use of cobalt as a catalyst worldwide. So the next time some gammon drives up to you in a diesel Range Rover and says, EVs are bad because of cobalt, actually, there's more cobalt used by that diesel Range Rover than there is by a standard range Tesla Model 3, standard range MG4, anything that BYD's making, and loads of other EVs to boot. And if he tries to tweet about how bad EVs are, tell him that there's more cobalt in his smartphone as well. Lithium. So we'll rifle through this because I'm aware we're up against time, but is lithium recovered from batteries today? I said originally not really because it was so cheap to obtain, despite some of the kind of false accusations of being a rare earth element. There are no rare earth elements in an EV battery. But we're now starting to see increasingly efficient recycling techniques that do recover lithium. And again, there are EU battery regulation targets that mean that there is going to be that circular economy established, and lithium, recycled lithium, is going to make it into new EV batteries from the early 2030s. We're not going to run out. This is actually an old figure here, saying that there's 14 million tons of known lithium reserves on land, which is enough for over 1 billion Nissan Leafs. But there's 230 billion tons of lithium in the ocean if we particularly need it. So that's enough for almost 19 trillion Nissan Leafs. We are not going to run out. But in terms of land-based reserves, we're up to over 100 million tons of identified lithium reserves now. We keep finding more. And in Europe, there's some really exciting examples. So there's lithium-rich brines and hard rocks in Cornwall. Portugal has it's the 7th largest lithium producer, and Czechia is sitting on the 4th largest non-brine lithium deposit. Germany has found some pretty rich lithium brines under the Rhine as well. Are we going to be priced out by increasing demand? Again, no. If we have a look at the example of lithium quadrupling in price, you will see that the sell price barely moves. That actually did move there, about 1.6% cost increase, no change to the consumer. And in terms of the extraction of lithium, see that little example down on the bottom left there? Those are your typical ways of extracting lithium brine. So that's evaporation ponds that you'll find in arid places like Bolivia and so on, where you need to pump lots of fresh water from these arid areas onto these evaporation ponds in drought-prone areas to try and extract lithium from those rich brines. What we can do now is direct lithium extraction. So we pump up that brine, we selectively remove the lithium, and we get 3 times the yield in hours rather than weeks or months, and then put the brine back where we found it without the lithium in it. So actually, some of these resources are geothermal brines, and that means that some of these processes, including the Cornish one that I mentioned earlier, may be able to power themselves with the heat from the brine. So no need for evaporation ponds. You've saved a heck of a lot of fresh water where it's needed, and you're potentially not using any fresh water at all in the extraction process now. And when EV batteries do eventually die, they've still got a long career left in them. So end of life for an EV battery is defined as 70% of its original capacity, 70% state of health with respect to capacity. But that's still loads of usable range. I've taken a picture of a Nissan Leaf here as an example, but if we were to look at the likes of a Hyundai Kona, which could do 400 kilometers when it was new, again, imperial to metric on the fly here, but you're easily looking at 300 kilometers, actually just shy of 300 kilometers per charge from a supposedly dead battery. That's still more than enough for most. So plenty of usable remaining capacity. And if it's not enough for you to be driving around in, what you can do is you can drop out that battery pack and stick it into second life energy storage. So rather than making batteries just for use in energy storage, you can use supposedly dead EV ones for years or even decades. And the reason that's feasible is because if you have a look at the drive pattern, a typical duty cycle of an EV, there's a lot of harsh acceleration, regenerative braking, fast charging, And it's quite inconsistent. It's quite dynamic because there's a human operator. And that's supposed to be hard on the battery, but we know that EV batteries are outlasting expectations. So imagine just how much longer they're going to last when they have much lower, more consistent loads and charging patterns applied to them. They have a very easy life in static energy storage. And that means that that trajectory of degradation is reduced considerably. And you just manage to further extend the lifespan of these EV batteries. And if they fundamentally do get recycled, I mentioned there's increasingly efficient recycling techniques. We started off with pyrometallurgical, where you just chuck them all in a furnace and get about 40% of the materials out. Then we moved to hydrometallurgical, where we kind of eat them apart with acids, and we get about 95% of the materials out. We're now looking at direct recycling techniques where there's no strong acids, and there's something like 100 times the throughput. The University of Birmingham has come up with an incredible example, and if you go on to Plug Life Television and look at that episode, you'll see more details about it. So social equality, we'll very quickly cover this because it is important. We want to make sure that there's access to affordable electric vehicles, access to the charging infrastructure for them, and we want to make sure that charging infrastructure is accessible and inclusive. Some people might think that EVs are too expensive to buy, but if you run the numbers, if we have a look at a Nissan Leaf, which is a borderline indestructible EV, you can get one for about €3,500. Typically the cheapest modern EV. It will do motorway speeds, it will rapid charge. If you were to get a 3-year personal loan, that's €107 per month. 5-year personal loan, €68 per month, or the Energy Saving Trust Scotland 6-year interest-free used EV loan, that's less than €50 per month. Inspiration to be replicated in Ireland, particularly with an emphasis on used. But is that good value for money? Well, let's compare it to the cheapest petrol car that I could find on AutoTrader for a mere £195, but I'm going to give it you for free. So if we have a look at the numbers here, not enough time to kind of run through it all, but trust me, those are the figures there if you want to screenshot it. It works out cheaper with that personal loan I was talking about, the 3-year personal loan. Works out cheaper considerably than the petrol car that you were given for free. Bearing in mind that you're looking at €167 of fuel, of petrol per month alone. The overall cost is only about €20 more than that for the EV. And of course, once you've added on all the other costs for the petrol car, it's just, the figure is massive. The savings are massive. And then if we look at the Transport Scotland or Energy Saving Trust Scotland interest-free loan example, €105 to €106 per month for the EV. So it's about €60 cheaper than just the petrol for the petrol car. But the poorest people don't drive. Electrification can still balance social equality. And also that's not necessarily true about the poorest people not driving, of course. Some people will try to claim that. So former Scottish Transport Secretary Michael Matheson said he was keen to make sure that EVs do not become a middle-class pastime. And it's very important to consider solutions that work for more people, ideally everyone. So EV hire clubs, electrified public transport, e-bike promotion, and autonomous shared vehicles as a service eventually. So again, using a good example of Ireland's progress by showing you a car hire club in Dundee, but there are plenty that exist in Ireland. Electric public transport, not least the battery electric DART extension in electrification, is a prime example of the success of batteries in helping to electrify public transport and ditch diesel. E-bikes, I mean, the bike library at UCD is stuff of legend and has been a roaring success and needs to be replicated elsewhere. And shared autonomous vehicles, obviously there's so many photographs of vaporware in this, and I've shown you a prime example, I think, from Renault. But there are genuinely shared autonomous electric vehicles out there. Typically in America, where roads are big and wide and kind of grid-shaped, and it's easier to navigate than the kind of twisty-turny back roads near Athlone and so on. But it will come eventually, one would hope, at least in some parts of Ireland. The advantages, you've got vastly reduced pollution. Technically, you need less vehicles to ferry people around as well, hopefully. Improved comfort of public transport, telling you now, having switched from diesel buses to electric near where I live, they are appealing rather than a sort of operator of last resort that they used to be for so many. Reduced running costs of public transport, improved reliability, vastly reduced maintenance, vastly reduced fuel costs, etc. And improved public health because you've not got as many diesel fumes kicking about. And also because you're using e-bikes, you're cheating yourself fit. Access to charging infrastructure for everyone. Well, if you don't have off-street parking, we've all seen the lamppost charge points that are available, but you now get cable gullies that allows you as the homeowner to put a charge point on your wall and then run a cable from your front door safely underneath the pavement under a little trip-proof cover to the curb. The UK government is now funding this, and I would strongly recommend that Ireland embraces it too. Likewise, cable gantries, so you're going above ground at a safe height and then dropping the cable at the curb at the car. Again, Ireland needs to be embracing this, and that puts all ownership and liability on the householder rather than the local authority as well. So what's not to like? Local authorities, as I said, should absolutely embrace these because I mean, you're looking at far less government expenditure being required and far more of the individual being able to electrify where they can. You've also got the issue of what if people misuse public charging infrastructure. Traffic regulation orders are absolutely essential. Make sure that if there's an electric vehicle charging bay, that is made for charging EVs only, not parking an EV, not parking a petrol car, and make sure that it's policed. Shameless plug, my little side project, ChargeSaint, is an app that allows you to report blocked and broken charging infrastructure directly to the local authority, the charging network, whoever it may be, someone who can do something about it. So there's ways and means of being able to provide that sort of coverage beyond large charging hubs where the likes of ANPR cameras would be economically viable. This could be deployed absolutely anywhere, and it's cheaper than those hardware-based solutions. Examples of stuff that we've actually picked up. You can see, for example, highway maintenance vehicles that have been blocking an on-street charge point for 5 months, and they've not bothered to relay this back to the charge point operator. So they still said on their app that the charge point was available. And one particularly petty EV driver who decided to claim a public charge point as their own by chaining and padlocking their plug into the charge point, so you physically couldn't unplug it. This is the stuff that you just won't pick up with hardware-based solutions, but when you've got eyes on the ground, that's invaluable. And then arguably the most important slide when we're considering public charging infrastructure, make sure that it works for as many people as possible. Accessibility and inclusivity are invaluable. The UK's PASS 1899 guidance is regarded as a world-leading guidance, but there's a consultancy called ChargeSafe, which goes above and beyond that. They have a 144-point site check that they do for these criteria. They truly understand the needs of not just people with limited mobility, but for example, lone women traveling at night. Is the place safely lit? Are there amenities nearby? Is it genuinely somewhere you'd be happy to get out of the car? This is invaluable to make sure that we all are able to transition to EVs, and it's not just fit, burly, able-bodied men who will be doing this. We need it to cover absolutely everyone in this transition. So the consultancy cost to do something like this, to engage true experts on this, is a drop in the ocean versus hardware costs to actually install the site, and even cheaper than having to rip out the entire site and start again. The slide that you can see just in the background there, you can see, for example, there's a curb up to the chargers. That's going to be a nightmare for anyone who's in a wheelchair, for example. And then the screen height at that point is going to be quite awkward. There's a whole bunch of things wrong with that charging hub that was state of the art when it was first released. And the likes of ChargeSafe would be able to rifle through exactly what those are and make sure that you don't make the same mistake. And it's also worth pointing out that even if you are able-bodied and you're not afraid of the dark and you're not afraid of anyone who might be hiding in the dark, safer sites are more attractive sites for everyone. If we design these properly, more people will be happy to use that infrastructure, which improves utilization and improves EV uptake. So I strongly recommend that anyone involved in designing or funding charging looks at this guidance and looks at these experts. So very finally, only a couple of minutes to spare, I think. Balancing the books, of course, what we're going to need to fill the gap that's vacated by vehicle excise duty and also by fuel tax for petrol and diesel vehicles. And at the moment, it looks like there would be a bit of a treasury shortfall. How do we fill that? Well, one of the things that's been proposed, I believe literally within the last few hours over in the UK, is pay per mile or pay per kilometre, which is incredibly controversial for various reasons. But that said, it could potentially have its merits. So pay per kilometre could be implemented when you check the mileage of the vehicle at its MOT, and it would encourage active travel and use of public transport unless you actually needed to drive. But it does penalise rural motorists who rely on their car due to a lack of decent public transport infrastructure options. Therefore, we need to be, particularly in Ireland with this huge kind of rural areas, we need to be considering this, because Scotland's in the same book. Like, we could be penalising people in the Scottish Highlands and Islands, for example. But there's a couple of ways that you could do pay per kilometre. You could do the flat rate, which is, as described above, it would penalise low mileage motorists, it would penalise rural motorists. But you could also do variable smart pay per kilometre as well, where you would fit what could potentially be perceived by some as an intrusive black box within the vehicle. It would look at the roads that are being driven and go, right, these are rural routes, therefore you would pay less per that kilometre than you would if you were driving in Dublin city centre, for example. So where there was no real public transport alternative, you would have, you know, that reflected in the cost of your road tax every year. But the other thing that you could do is you could anonymise that data from those black boxes, and you could actually identify decent well-paying, well-sustainable public transport routes that are not currently in existence, because you just suddenly have this hive mind of almost 2.5 million motorists, plus logistics, plus HGVs, buses, and so on. You know, well, maybe not buses, but there might be soon. So you'd be looking at where's everyone going to? Are there specific times a day that loads of people happen to be migrating in the same direction where there are no bus routes? Can we actually build an electric public transport alternative to private cars in this area? So that's some food for thought anyway, but we could also give choice of a non-smart versus a smart paid per kilometre for motorists to try and balance the Treasury's books on this. Now, I'm aware that we've got a highly engaging panel session coming up, so I'll leave it there, but I've got loads more information like this on Plug Live Television on YouTube, and as I said, anything to do with technical, strategic, or public outreach, or anything to do with batteries, EVs, charging infrastructure, and static energy storage, you'll find me at consultant@pluglivetelevision.co.uk, and I will leave you with my very first EV, which was a 1999 Peugeot 106 electric with NiCad batteries. There weren't many of them. Peugeot did actually factory build it as an EV. Made it up to the top of the Dundee Law, which is the really big hill in Dundee. Being a 20 kilowatt motor, it picked the speed it wanted to do it, but it got there in the end. How we have come on since then. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. You covered a lot of ground there. Usually we have technical talks, we have policy talks there. You managed to cover the societal, the policy, the technical, all in one talk. So thank you very much for that. So now I'm going to ask my two panelists to give their insights. I think first, maybe Dr. Caulfield or Professor Caulfield, on your insights on electric vehicles and where we're at, and maybe in Ireland context.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Lisa. A fantastic talk, very interesting, and an awful lot of food for thought for us here in Ireland. I suppose we've got three kind of key messages that I'd like to talk about. And you kind of mentioned some of it there about the grid, but it's the capacity of the grid and its ability to be able to electrify the amount of vehicles that or cars that we want to have in this country. We've just finished a study, and it's under review at the moment, between the schools of engineering and physics and Trinity, and we mapped rural Ireland. We looked at the capacity, we looked at the substations, and even if we get in less than 25% of the target that IFA is working to striving towards. It's not IFA's target, it's all of our targets, but that's ESB is striving towards. There would be blackouts, and that's not even taking into account any house that perhaps wants a heat pump or any electrify anything else. So the kind of unsexy thing to say, I think the biggest challenge that we have for electric vehicles in this country is not batteries, the ethics, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. It is the grid, and the grid needs to be upgraded in order, and specifically in the areas of the country that it needs to be upgraded are the areas in which people are driving the most. And if we look at, that kind of brings me on to my second point, is that if we're looking at electric vehicles as a means not to sell cars, but to decrease our emissions, we're selling all of our EVs in the leafy suburbs of Dublin and Cork to the most wealthy people that drive the least. I've published work on it, I know Lisa has as well. That shows that we're selling these EVs perhaps in the wrong area. And if we want to, if reducing emissions is our goal, I think we need to fundamentally to change our trajectory there as to where we're selling electric vehicles. And as you rightly suggest, and I've been saying it for a number of years, that Scotland have a huge number of incentives and a huge number of very innovative ways, and our demographics are very similar, and our distribution of people are very similar. So it would be great to see some of those policies make it across from Scotland here into Ireland. And then finally, one of the things that EVs that we've been talking about today will not do, it will not ease the congestion on the M7, it will not ease the congestion on the M50, it will not stop Dublin in 2040 spending 40 billion euro a year, or sorry, not 40 billion, 1.5 billion euro a year on congestion. It's not going to solve that. EVs aren't going to solve congestion in Galway. So putting more cars in and going to all this extra effort to make these cars happen is not going to make our cities more livable. It's not going to reduce our travel times. It's not going to increase our well-being. So when we look at mobility and electric mobility, I do think we need to focus more on the shared side of it. One thing I would say on the shared side is that only 3% of the Irish rail network is electrified. That compares to 58% average across the European Union. So we are, there are many countries that obviously they're very far ahead of us on that. There is progress with the battery electric trains that are going to happen on the two dark lines to the west of the city. But progress there is mind-numbingly slow in terms of electrification of rail. The other thing I think we need to do more on, and I think there needs to be stronger government incentives, is around shared electric mobility. You mentioned our project, the Robust project. We're launching four hubs. Three of them have been launched so far, one in Letterkenny, one in Galway, and one in Waterford. And at each of those hubs, there are shared electric vehicles, e-cargo bikes and e-bikes for people to use. Those cars typically, when you have a shared car in a town or a city, it tends to get rid of 10 other cars. So they really sweat the asset. They really sweat this climate tool that we have, which is an electric car, to its maximum potential. And equally with taxis, there has been a very slow uptake with taxis, despite the very generous grants that are provided. And we see that, and research that we've conducted in Trinity shows for every one taxi that you take off the road, it's about 2.5. They drive about 2.5 times as a regular car. So I do think that we need to massively incentivize those shared modes more so than the rest. But just to finish, if I still have time, on a moment, on a positive note, we have met our 2025 target. We are seeing the change start to happen. We are, I think, gone past perhaps the plateau that was maybe there a year or so ago. But to bring people along with us, I do think that we need to be more nuanced and fairer in the way in which we give out our grants right across the country.
Thanks, Brian. That's very interesting. That's interesting about taxis. I feel like there's so many electric taxis around.
I'm going to challenge that one.
Yeah, okay. I'll hand over to you.
Yeah. So just on that point, I know that we're about 5 or 6% of the general car fleet is electric, but I know that on the taxi fleet, it's 3 times that. So the penetration, now, in fairness, the EV taxi grant is highly generous. So I don't know, and we are maxed out every year in it, but the penetration in the taxi fleet is actually much higher, 3 times higher than the average car fleet. So it could be higher. It could always be higher. Yes, but I'm just saying, but it is actually doing very well, and the penetration is there and the uptake is there. There's so much food for thought in Euan's presentation and in Brian's comments as well. And I guess in ZEVI, so I'll take the 2025 target. I will take as EFA's target because we've achieved that. The 2030 target can be a national target. But the and that's really good news. What we're trying to do now, as in terms of policy, is okay. We've achieved the first target. The 2030 target of having 30% of the fleet being electric is still an incredibly challenging target for us to get to. So putting into place the measures and incentives that will deliver that is going to require an awful lot of work, an awful lot of effort, and an awful lot of uptake. So we have to get that right. We're also in the middle now of one of the things for the first couple of years when we were set up, and I'd go in and talk to our board or boards of TII or other organizations or ministers, and it's like, not another strategy. Can you just build something, please? But after 2 or 3 years of this, the strategies are actually beginning to have effect, and we can see coming in from the information that the procurements that have gone out on the national road, the motorway, the national secondary road scheme, which is actually the really interesting one because that gets high-powered EV chargers out in the very far west, out around Balmullet, South Kerry, Northwest Donegal, that those are going to be delivered in a significant way in the next 12 to 18 months. So that's really good news, and we'll begin to see that delivery. This morning I was at a local authority network meeting in Tullamore, where we have 22 EV officers across the local authorities in place, with another 18 to be employed over the next 6 months, and they will take responsibility for procuring and delivering those local EV networks. So that's all really good, and I guess that's where our focus has been primarily for the past couple of years, to trying to get all of this set up. The next stage as we begin to look at is actually, well, how do we now, we've got the transition, we've got over the hump in 2024, although I would say we're actually only back up to where we were in 2023. Our EV numbers are higher than ever, but our EV as a proportion of overall sales is only where it was in 2023. So in my mind, we've lost 2 years of growth. We've plateaued on where we were. I would love to see it kick up again next year, but it remains to be seen where it will now settle. But our focus really now is on trying to get that just transition in. So part of it will be getting fast, high-speed charging in rural areas. One of the things that we have said in ZEVI and in government is that any EV charging that receives Exchequer funding has to adhere to our universal design guidelines. So they have taken from the UK guidelines, but also built on German accessibility guidelines in the US, and it's looking at digital accessibility, physical accessibility for people with mobility issues, people with vision issues, safety issues, protection from weather, all of that stuff. And we have said, okay, so if we're putting state funding into EV charging, we need to make sure that it's accessible for all citizens, not just some. The other option, of course, is to electrify accessible parking bays. But of course, that means that only people with blue badges will be able to use those parking bays and charge from them. So we think that's wasteful of resources. It makes much more sense to get the EV chargers out there that they can just be used by everyone. And then the other issues that we're looking at are people on the second-hand market. I mentioned earlier, it's more challenging in Ireland than it is in the UK, and that's a feature of our car market. In the UK, 70% of all cars are corporate, and in Ireland, it's about 30%. But that means that in the UK, 70% of their vehicles are recycled every 3 years and returned to the market for second-hand. In Ireland, it's only 30%. So we're dealing with an EV portion, which is of 30% of the car market anyway, that we need to get into second-hand EVs. So I think we're watching that. We're trying to make sure that there's enough of, I guess, a stable supply of second-hand EVs, and then I think we'll try and bring in an incentive there. And the last one, which we're working on at the moment, which I think has everyone very interested, is this cross-gully or overhang solution. Our slight challenge on that is that it's currently illegal in Ireland to run a wire across a private footpath. So we've been working with colleagues in the Department of Communications, or it's not Communications anymore, Department of Energy, and they are advancing legislation on the use of private wires, not just for EVs, but also for battery generation for data centres. But there's an EV aspect of that. So we're expecting the heads of that legislation to be published in December. That would mean that ideally, then the legislation would actually come through in the second half of next year. And that then means that we can start to fund those really, really simple, they will solve so many problems for so many people. And it also means that rather than maybe putting out a lot of low-powered, low-charging solution in convenient areas where people can charge near to their home at night, we can focus on maybe getting the more commercially viable charging solutions out there, which is 50 kilowatts and above. And the apartment charges is still a problem, but for people who have on-street access, if not off-street parking, they can avail of that curb channel solution.
Okay, there's a lot there. Thank you very much, Aoife. Maybe back to you, Euan, for a second. You mentioned the different types of technologies. So which is the one that you think is emerging, or what will be the future of EVs? Is there a likely particular individual technology, or is it going to be a portfolio of different ones?
Well, with regards to battery chemistry, we're already seeing a diversification in chemistry. It's all under the broad church of lithium-ion, and therefore, the gigafactories in which they're made, I suppose, are broadly interchangeable. But the difference between lithium iron phosphate for short-range vehicle, or standard range vehicles, definitely not short-range these days, and NMC variants for longer-range vehicles, that seems to be the kind of standard for now. But we could see NMC being retired sooner than we previously thought. So we're starting to see a greater diversification in this. For example, LFP has been cleverly modified, so you're substituting, I think it's typically about 60% of the iron for manganese or some other fairly abundant metal to create LMFP. And that boosts the voltage of the cell, and bearing in mind that the capacity that you can store in kilowatt hours within a particular cell is equal to its capacity in ampere hours multiplied by its voltage, the kind of staircase, or the height of the staircase, if you wish. Obviously, the higher the voltage, the more capacity to store, or the more energy you can store within a particular format. So that means that you could use this very cheap chemistry for long-range vehicles, because it's broadly the same sort of range as NMC is today that you'd be able to get out of LMFP. Meanwhile, I think it's Ford and their engineers over in the States have developed a lithium manganese-rich material. So it's like NMC, but they've ramped up the manganese, reduced the nickel, and eliminated the cobalt. So again, cheap materials. That's how Ford reckons that's going to go. Meanwhile, LFP is kind of looking over its shoulder because sodium ion is on the horizon, and that's threatening to eat LFP's lunch. So not only is sodium even more abundant, not only is it even cheaper, not only is it even safer, we've not even discussed the safety aspects, but well, just so you know, it's a lot rosier than you might think, but particularly with LFP. But sodium ion just, it ticks all the boxes apart from energy density. But we're now starting to see the energy density of sodium ion creeping up to close to that of LFP. And because it's so cheap, or at least it will be once it's being produced at scale, you'll be able to get city cars and sort of short to standard range EVs that undercut today's, the likes of the new Renault Twingo that's coming on the market. You'll be able to shave a couple of grand off of that at least with this new chemistry.
So just to follow on that, do you think costs are still coming down quite a bit? Like they have dropped, battery costs have come down quite a bit in the last 5 years even.
Yeah.
What's the projection?
The projection is if you're holding out for batteries to get even cheaper, I'd recommend buying an EV fairly soon, because all of the experts like Benchmark Mineral Intelligence and so on, experts in supply chain, are forecasting that within the next decade or so, there's going to be a significant deficit of raw material supply coming through. It's not a case of we don't have enough on the earth, it's just extracting it quick enough. There's going to be a deficit for nickel, for lithium, even for cobalt, and that's being phased out, versus demand as demand starts to grow exponentially. And it takes decades sometimes for new mines to come online. So yes, the circular economy side of things, we're currently globally over capacity for recycling batteries, but those batteries aren't ready to recycle yet because they're outlasting expectations. So we need new supply, and that new supply is not coming through. So we'll see an uptick in the price of raw materials to the extent that we do start to see EV batteries getting more expensive. I mentioned obviously if cobalt and lithium were to quadruple in price overnight, that you wouldn't see much of a difference. If you're looking at high nickel batteries and nickel goes up in cost, then absolutely you'll start to see a difference. That's when we'll start to see sodium ion being commercialized a lot quicker, because there's been such a suppression in lithium ion costs, which are at an all-time low due to demand increasing, but not as quickly as everyone in the world had forecasted. We're starting to see interest in sodium ion being sort of put on the back burner because there's not as much of a cost difference. But as soon as those prices for lithium ion raw materials tick up again, all of your major cell manufacturers are going to go and double down on their sodium ion development. So there will be this kind of bump, where you will start to see EV prices go up again, but then your kind of entry-level EVs might actually start to reduce in price as sodium ion comes online.
Okay, that's kind of a complex picture, isn't it?
Yeah.
But thank you very much. Now we're coming to the times where I'd like to open it up a little bit. So I see, well, I think I'm going to ask a question here that I see already online, and I'll go to the audience just because this kind of fits a little bit, Brian, with what you were talking about there in terms of shared mobility. If we're talking about autonomous, this is from Cormac McKay, will autonomous vehicle shared mobility replace private car ownership? And will this help share electric vehicles and make so that individually cars are actually a luxury that very few people actually have?
I think that could happen. And yeah, it could possibly happen that you would have these autonomous vehicles, navigating our streets and all the rest. There's a huge amount of technology that's required in order to make that happen. There's a huge amount of data that needs to be stored from all of the cameras and all of the data that's going to be required for these cars to go around. That data needs to live somewhere. It's in a data warehouse. That increases our energy costs in that place. But we have the technologies right now that work. We've a Lewis, we've bus, we've bikes. All of these work right now. And the amount of effort that we're putting into keep us encapsulated in our steel cans as they go around the streets, to me is a little bit mind-boggling, because I don't think it's going to solve, I don't think it's going to solve congestion. I don't think it's going to solve any of the big issues that we have in mobility. Exactly, yeah.
I think, so I agree. I mean, I think EVs aren't the solution for the city. They do clean our air, but it doesn't create a livable city. It doesn't create a city that's more pleasant to be in. You're just stuck in your car, which happens to not pipe out carbon emissions or as much air pollutants, but you're still stuck in your car. However, one thing where I think EVs will have an edge over shared vehicles, and Euan, I know will have an opinion on this as well, but we haven't seen it yet. But we think in 2027, we will have the first home chargers coming on stream that are available of vehicle to grid connection. And then what we have is you don't own a car, you own a battery. The battery happens to be on wheels and can transport you. But once we have that, you've mentioned our renewables, a lot of Irish renewables, although solar is increasing, comes from wind. We know wind is particularly heavy at night compared to, but our energy demand drops during the night. So then we have a situation where you can have your battery on wheels, which happens to be a car, but actually you can plug it into your house supply. It can take energy from the grid through your charger at a point when, and I know some companies are already doing this, when the energy cost is negative. And then you can store it in your battery and you can either use that in the day for free or less than free, or you can sell it back to the grid at a cost when the grid is under demand between 5 and 7 p.m. And I think if we can get EVs to work as an energy management system, as part of solar panels, as part of your heat pump, and as part of supporting the grid, then actually it becomes more financially beneficial for the user. But that also means that people will have an interest in maybe owning an EV rather than just sharing one. Having said that, shared cars in terms of car travel are hugely important for cities. But I do think we haven't seen what the behavioural response to that technology will be yet, because it's not here yet. But from 2027, it will be really, really interesting to watch.
Can I just follow up that with a question on the regulatory situation? Because I mean, we do see vehicle to grid happening in other countries, but not in Ireland. And when you mentioned 2027, is there some regulatory magic happening then? Or
what we think is that, well, vehicle to grid does happen in Ireland. What I was talking about particularly was home chargers. So what we're seeing is that there's the SEAI run our home charger grant, and you have to have an approved list of chargers that you can use. And at the moment, they're not capable yet of vehicle. They're capable of vehicle to load, but they're not capable of vehicle to grid. And what the SEAI are telling us is that the first approvals for vehicle to grid home charging solutions are likely to come on in 2027. That's because Europe, the EU, has published a directive, the European Performance of Building Directive, that requires a certain amount of bidirectional charging and to be present in new builds for residential and non-residential from 2027. So that's what the ISO standard seems to be targeted for, and that's when that type approval will come in.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just going to ask whether our audience here, yes, please, if you could mention your organisation as well as introduction.
Yeah, my name is Michael.
Yeah.
I'm a recent MBA graduate, so I don't actually have an organisation at the minute. But my question is for the panel's thoughts on comparing for upgrading the issue or fixing the issue of the rural grid and the lack of capacity there, investing through subsidies so that individuals sort of solve their own problem via solar panels and battery storage, versus those subsidies instead being spent on upgrading the grid, putting in those installations, sort of to house by house and sort of family by family. What are your thoughts on the effectiveness of each of those options and how they compare?
Okay, would you like to say that, Euan? Or
sure, I'll start anyway, because I think there's definitely, we'll all have loads of thoughts on this. Certainly in rural Scotland, there's already a significant incentive to go as self-sufficient as you can, because typically you're not on the gas grid, so central heating is going to be expensive oil or copious amounts of wood. So heat pumps are already a no-brainer. Loads of people are fitting those where they can, and then you tend to get a battery, and then you tend to get solar panels, and you end up doing the whole kind of self-sufficiency journey. Those who can afford it and those who can avail of subsidies that help them to afford it have typically started to go for it. That said, there's also the strong argument of the sort of looking at a national level, and that could potentially be done in conjunction with co-ops building wind farms and so on. And when you have a cooperative where there's buy-in either from local communities and certainly dividends for local communities, you end up with minimal objections because people actually get something out of this new structure that's been built near you. But something that sadly, the company went bust recently, but there was a company called Ripple in the UK where you could buy a share of new, effectively nationally community-owned wind farms. So I own about a kilowatt's worth of capacity of a 2 megawatt wind turbine on a wind farm somewhere in Ayrshire. where I'm originally from. But I now live on the East Coast, but it chucks out electricity, gets sold to the wholesale grid, and then I end up getting sort of the dividends from that off of my electricity bill. So there's loads of different incentives that we could do. And I think that, yeah, I mean, looking at sort of national grid upgrades, we could be quite clever if we go down the kind of individual route and then bring in vehicle to grid, as you said, and then before you know it, you might not need as much capacity because it's being locally generated and stored and so on. And if you can unlock the private capital of the households in order to do that, then you've saved a lot of money nationally. But then again, you'll still need national scale infrastructure projects, and that's where you can be clever with the Ripple business model, if it can be made to not go bust this time. And cooperative, cooperatively owned and community dividended renewables and grid storage. But I'll hand over.
Okay. Does anyone else want?
Yeah. Congratulations on the MBA. But yeah, so I think it comes back to, do we count everything as cumulative, or do we bring in more smart ways of managing and controlling grid demand? And key to that is pricing. So absolutely the grid needs to be upgraded. It's just to what extent. So we've seen ESB Networks come into the Commission for Regulation of Utilities for PR6, and the response has been out, and now we're going to get the final determination. ESB have gone back in with their response and Cruise response. So it's everyone's talking to each other. And that allows for a significant investment in upgrading both the transmission and the distribution grid. So the grid upgrade will come. But I think it's just when do we say, okay, this is enough, and now it's almost like road use. If everyone drives on the roads, if all the cars drive on the road at all the time, we will have congestion. If we price it appropriately, we will manage that travel demand, and people will drive at cheaper times or when it's quieter, and then all of a sudden you've better use of your roads. That's exactly what we need for the grid. So what we need to see really from the energy companies, and it'll be interesting to see what the regulators' approach is to push this a bit more, is a much more responsive price indicator to the home user, to the business user, to make sure that they're pushing people to use the grid when it's at its over capacity or at capacity to draw down and store energy, and then, as I said before, with the EV, sell it back. And if we do that properly, then we don't need to keep building roads. There'll be a point when we're using the grid optimally, and we don't need to keep adding to it in the same way.
Thank you. Actually, we have a lot of online questions, so if you don't mind, we might push on. Or actually, does anybody have a question here first? Otherwise, then I'll go through some of the online questions. Okay, great. Not great, but feel free to jump in if you have one. There's a few questions here. One I thought was interesting in terms of if we're looking at, sorry, there's one here, actually an interesting one. A flight had to be diverted because a laptop fell down a seat in a lithium, and it had to be diverted because it had a lithium battery in it, and they said that the flight was in danger. What does Euan say about that? We'll come back to that in a sec. There you go. But actually, there was one here that I thought was interesting for Aoife and Brian, perhaps. What can we say about battery life in the second-hand market? I think a lot of people are very worried about that, and also in the context of vehicle to grid, are we going to run down the batteries? Yeah. So there's some interesting questions there. And the third one maybe is on data centers. You mentioned data centers. Nora Owen, one of our board members, mentioned, what maybe you could clarify your thoughts. So I don't know if any of you can pick any of those questions you like, guys. Brian, maybe I left you out the last round.
Sure, okay. Just quickly on the grid thing, once it's done with a just transition lens, and we're looking, because everywhere we're giving out grants right now are to the most wealthy people in terms of solar, in terms of heat pumps, in terms of EVs. Once it's done with a just transition lens, I think that's the important thing, and we need to do it clever, as Aoife and Euan have both said. In terms of the second-hand battery, confidence is a massive thing, and the picture, the 10-year-old's Leaf that you put up there, first thing I thought was range. Who's going to buy that if the range isn't there? We do need to communicate about range. We do need to kind of bust an awful lot of myths. I think one of the things, and I think it's dissipated quite a bit recently, but there was a minor very vocal grouping within Ireland that were completely dismissing electric vehicles, calling them white goods, treating them like washing machines, which is absolute utter nonsense. These vehicles are the most technically savvy. They are fantastic in what they do, but we do need to work with people. We do need to bust that range anxiety. There's a project that we're finishing up at the end of next year with SCAI, and that has a digital twin with an app basically. gets people with a nice car to drive around, and then it tells them what their range that they're likely to be. So that then does give them, say, well, look, you know, you could do everything in a week with a battery that had a range of 150 kilometers. And I think what happens with people on the range thing is they think of the one trip that they take that, you know, for me, it's probably Dublin to Baltimore. And if I do that, where do I have to stop? Will there be a charger there? I do that twice a year.
Cashel.
I got a new EV that gets me all the way. I got an ID3, but yes, that's the thing. But then at Cashel, I've often driven in there, and they're all full or out of order and all of that kind of stuff. So it's the confidence.
It does happen.
They are
It does
full.
happen.
They are full, but they're not.
I know that too.
On the second-hand battery, I think we were actually discussing this over lunch, and part of the problem is that when we talk about EV batteries, we talk about lithium, and the thing that comes up is mobile phones. And everyone knows that a mobile phone battery is gone after 3 years. So then they think, oh my God, my car's battery is going to last, but after 3 years, it will be down by 50%. So my 500-kilometer range will be 250 at best. And what actually happens is your EV battery is nothing like your mobile phone battery. It has a much longer, much more persistent range. What's the word? Range that it hangs on to its range. I mean, you were saying, Euan, that most OEMs will actually now sell a car with an 8-year or several 100,000 kilometers guarantee. We're talking to the SIMI, the Society of Irish Motor Industry, and they're saying most dealerships, when cars are coming back in for their 1, their 2-year, their 3-year check-in, that they're retaining a range reliability of about 98% range efficiency. So the cars are holding on to that range. It's not dissipating in the same way as it does seem to go from your mobile phone battery. However, the fact that it's not happening does not mean that that's the perception out there. So we are changing technology. We are changing technology in a really significant way. And at the moment, 20% of Irish people are buying EVs. That means that 80% aren't. That means that 80% of the population hasn't engaged with this technology yet, doesn't fully trust it. Part of it, unfortunately, is just the cost of transition, just the cost of change. So I would imagine in 5 to 6 years, when a lot more people have used and trialed an EV, and we are all far more used to this technology, those concerns won't be there. But unfortunately, until that happens, there will always be this perception. We're doing our best to get out there and combat it and kind of say, well, actually, this is the reality, but the perception will always be there until people get into an EV and experience it themselves.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, there's a couple of things there for you as well.
Yeah, I mean, on the battery warranty side, yeah, as you rightly said, Eva, you know, automotive manufacturers are not going to offer a warranty where they reckon that the product will fail within that period. And some of the latest chemistry iterations we've seen, a prime example is CATL, giant Chinese cell manufacturer, have just recently released a new electric bus battery, which has a 15-year, 1.5 million kilometer warranty. I can bore you for the electrochemical reason as to how they managed to achieve that, but they reckon that bus will do 1.5 million kilometers before the battery even shows any kind of sign of failing. As for the sort of comment about, you know, like white goods, you know, they're not real cars. I mean, we're obviously dealing with some very insecure man-children saying that, and it's hard to not feel a bit sorry for them. But as for the valid question of, you know, the mobile phone or laptop that had slid between the seats on the airplane, you know, it's a little device and it's a big seat. And that big seat would basically be like a crusher if it was to be kind of, you know, folded back. It could bend the device. It could internally short the battery by kind of puncturing it and so on. And because it's a high cobalt containing chemistry, it's probably LCO. It will be a little firework that goes off. It'll be an instant sort of ball of flame, which you don't really want when you're in an enclosed tube at 37,000 feet. So, yeah, I mean, that said, you compare it to an EV battery where the crash protection structure, I mean, there's no way that an airplane seat's going to take that out. You know, in fact, there are plenty of really nasty accidents that have happened with electric cars where the battery has been completely intact, because aside from the human occupants, the battery is the most protected part of the car. It is centrally located with loads of crash protection structure around it. And also the chemistry is different and it's liquidly thermally managed, so it can wick away heat before it becomes an issue. There's loads of different safety systems that are built in that you physically couldn't shoehorn into a phone or a laptop. So yeah, and as we start to see new chemistries coming along, we haven't even mentioned solid state. all solid state electrolytes are not going to be particularly interesting in a horrible high-speed crash, even if the battery did get ripped open, because any kind of flammability of some of those electrolytes, it'd be a bit like if I stood at this wooden table with a cigarette lighter, it might eventually go up, but there's not any liquid, volatile organic liquid to catch fire or to vent gases. So you'd be looking at twice the range of what we have today, and some very boring videos on YouTube of someone in their back garden taking a drill to it and expecting a firebomb, and it just doesn't happen.
Okay, I think we'll stop you there.
Yeah, sorry, go for it.
There's many of the iterations. So there's a question here and a question here. So I think you were first. Yeah. And then I think we will need to wrap up. Oh, there's a third question. Okay, 3 questions, and then is that all right, Barry? Are we allowed?
Yes, and we started with minutes late.
Oh, you're right. Yeah, we did.
Hi, Brian Daly. I'm on the board here in the Institute, and thanks to the presenters, they were great and really interesting. A myth or bust question, or myth or not myth question, the weight of cars. I hear people say that the car parks in Dublin wouldn't be able to cope if every car in the car park was an EV, or that a country like Norway, which have a big adoption of EVs, the roads, the asphalt roads don't actually sustain because of the weight of the cars. Is that true? Not true? And where are things going?
From my perspective, I'd be more worried about all the SUVs. They're going to be heavier, and we sell a huge amount of SUVs in this country. I think that perhaps has the bigger issue, but there is issues around rutting on roads when you use electric buses. But it's just basically reinforcing the asphalt that those buses go on. I don't think it's a massive issue. I think it's one of those myths, I think, that tend to go out there.
There we go. Professor in civil engineering has spoken. Next question, perhaps, please. There was one here and one at the back.
Hello, my name is Arpit. Trinity, a master's student at Trinity, responsible business sustainability. So my concern is regarding the end of life. Is it want to discuss about the destination, whether to make and ensuring that the battery after the usage reach the right destination, and how the battery design works. Is it feasible and energy efficient to extract the components out of it?
Thank you. Okay, would you like to take that?
Yeah,
Euan?
happy to. We're already starting to see, as I said, a global overcapacity of battery recycling in preparation for an eventual increase in end-of-life batteries coming through. But so many are getting swiped up for electric classic car retrofitting and second life energy storage at the domestic and grid scale. It will be a while before we see that. But we're starting to see really impressive recycling techniques coming through that recover high 90% of material from lithium-ion cells. And in terms of the logistics, there are companies that now specialize in the safe packaging and transporting of end-of-life and crash damaged batteries. Cling Energy Systems, Cling Systems, I'm going to give them a shout out, because they are like Europe's experts on this. But we're starting to see battery recycling facilities building up certainly in the UK. Altilium is a good example of this. And then also Water Cycle Technologies, which is a startup that just has the most phenomenal box of tricks that I won't bore you with just now. But yeah, the efficiency and the yield that they get from this. When it comes to end of life, the combination of not just what's technically feasible and logistically feasible, but also the regulations, the EU battery regulation, that's going to drive those batteries into that circular economy, and that's going to drive the extraction of as many resources as possible out of those cells. We're already starting to see a thriving secondhand / recycling market in China, where even lithium iron phosphate, which, as I said, is basically lithium rust and fertilizer, is being economically recycled, because lithium is now the most expensive material rather than one of the cheapest. And there's a thriving market for lithium, second life lithium, or second-hand lithium, I should say, which didn't exist only a few short years ago. The picture is so much rosier than some people would say. This whole thing about, so many lithium-ion batteries get landfilled. Yeah, perhaps the disposable ones out of vapes, or the ones out of disposable vapes that should never make it into landfill, but they do, because people just chuck them on the ground, let alone in a bin. But try stuffing an EV battery into your local recycling company. It's not going to happen. So it's a much easier asset to control. 100%.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, then we have final questions back here.
Hello, thank you. Mary Rose Gravel, Trinity Business School and member of the Institute. And this could sound very stupid now. On our MBA programs every year, we go to Leuven in Belgium. And all around Belgium, there are solar panels on all of the roofs and little turbines on the houses. I'm sure you all know, a lot of you have seen this already. And then along the motorway, there are turbines as well. And this is the stupid part of the question. I wondered about cars having a little solar panel and 2 little windmills on the side of the car, very small, but accessible into some kind of battery system that might actually work. And also in Ireland, I think we definitely need to have turbines along the motorways, and even small ones along motorways or along canals, or not along canals, along railways and stuff like that. So that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anyone interested to, Aoife, your turn?
You sure?
I was just saying, cars with solar panels in the roof, I think windmills might interfere with aerodynamics. So we would probably lose as much in the forward momentum as you would gain in the power. But I think there are EVs on the market with solar panels. I don't know how much, this is what I'm going to ask you, I don't know how much difference they actually make.
So at the moment, the EVs that are out there commercially with solar panels on them, they're topping up the auxiliary battery. So it's doing the lights, the wipers, the infotainment system, which has become quite power hungry in recent years across all cars because of our increasing demands for creature comforts. But for traction battery, there have been a couple of examples. So there was Sono Motors, which was on the slide for the Fair Cobalt Alliance members. And there was Lightyear, which was a Dutch company that had come up with a really aerodynamic car. Both of them were absolutely covered in solar panels. Now, I very quickly said the word "were" because both of those companies sadly went defunct before they could hit the big time. They were on to incredible products, but so often we find that promising startups run out of financial runway before they can hit the big time. If they'd been based in the States or China, they would have stood a chance. It's the sad reality of it. But yeah, they were able to add, I think, round about 30 kilometers of range per day if they were just sat outside on a really sunny day in like Spain or something like that. You know, in Ireland on a sunny day, you know, you would still get a meaningful amount of range. It wouldn't cover all of your driving requirements, but it would help a bit, and every little helps. So I agree with you. We might as well be encouraging this sort of technology. And who knows, it might end up being the likes of, I mean, if we were to go for any of the legacy automotive OEMs, I would say it's most likely going to be either Toyota or Mercedes that do it. Mercedes are putting a lot of effort into efficiency and lightweighting. And if you look at the EQXX prototype, which has actually lent a lot of its DNA to the new Mercedes CLA, that was designed with efficiency in mind. And the only car that really made that look inefficient was the Lightyear, which sadly no longer exists. So yeah, solar absolutely is an option. Wind, for the exact reasons you mentioned, turbulence, drag, you'd end up losing efficiency. But there are now wind turbines that work in turbulent air, so you could imagine them along the kind of central reservation of motorways. And in the rail sector, in the UK, we've seen examples of rail-side mounted solar panels running alongside the lines. So yeah, we could be making basically infrastructure cable tidies out of motorways and railway lines. Because if anyone complains about, oh, why are you putting this here? It's like, well, it's because that big noisy motorway, well, that was already there, so who cares? We should be doing that.
Thank you very much. Okay. Oh, we have a final question. Go on. This is really the final question. Okay.
Hi, Owen Ahern from Codema, Dublin's Energy Agency. Just a quick kind of wild idea. Electric roads, is this something that you think might ever actually materialize, say, on some of the major motorways in Ireland?
Thank you. Okay, I think this is, do you want to try, Brian? What do you
I
think?
just think the cost, Owen, I think is prohibitive. Perhaps you could see, I know that I've seen studies where they've used overhead gantries for heavy trucks. I think that's a goer, but perhaps not. But there's definitely scope for, you know, charging it at bus stops and all that kind of stuff. But overall, through the network,
I think our distances are too small. Where you see it being effective, it's in places like Finland or Norway, where there's like a really, or not Finland, Sweden or Norway, where there's a really, really long road that goes for thousands of kilometers. Here, like, you're going 300 kilometers, you're in the sea. So you can do that on a charge without needing to be topped up.
Okay, well, I think we'll leave it there then. I'd like to thank our panelists, and particularly Euan for his talk at the beginning, kicking us off, and also to Aoife and Brian for very good answers to questions. Thank you very much, and also thank you to all for coming, and thank you to our online audience, which I believe was very large. So that's great to have had so many people tuning in. So thank you all, and have a good day.
Yes.